Thank you for joining us today at Miniature Wargaming Labs, where today we will be painting one of the Metal Marines from the USMC starter set for bolt action for the Pacific Theater. Now that with the new bolt action campaign book, Mariana's, Pacific Theater is getting a little bit more love out of bolt action, out of Warlord games. So let's talk about how we painted this guy. You'll see it in the next segment, but primed him Krylon green, and then I primed over that in Army Painter Army Green, which is this color. I just like that step because it saves a lot of time. But the rest of the uniform is actually just a wash of Nuln oil with a little glaze of moot green to brighten up the spots hit by the sun. Alright, for the skin tone, we used some Menoth white base from P3's khaki color and tanned flesh with a wash in between applications of tanned flesh of Agrax Earthshade from Games Workshop. But we'll talk about later on, there's some other washes you can use. Now for the helmet, that is Vallejo Luftwaffe Camo Green with a dry brush of German Camo Beige World War II over the top. Alright, all the little pouches and straps going around him, that's German Camo Medium Brown and XV88. Now for the base, that's Dryad Bark, along with a dry brush of German Camo Beige to highlight the ridges that sculpted in there. Now he's got a little watch, and for his Thompson, it's mostly black. And for the wood parts of the Thompson, used Mornfang Brown. And for the watch face, used Palette of Witch Flesh. Now the Thompson, I did a highlight of Runefang Steel over that before I washed it with Nuln oil. And see, the boots are going to be Bugman's Glow. You don't have to use all the variety of browns and greens that I did. There's plenty of browns and greens out there, and given the inconsistency in coloring on the uniform due to the harshness of the climate in the Pacific, you can get away with a lot of colors there. Oh, I forgot to mention, some of the straps were also German Camo Beige there. But I use this one a lot, and actually you'll see at the end of it, the last step is I dry brush a very light coat of this over him to make some of his features pop out and give him a dustier, more worn look, especially applying it to the bottom of his pants there to show that the environment is rubbing off on him. But enough talking about it, let's get to painting this guy. To start painting, what I did is I primed this model gray using Krylon's gray primer. And the reason is that's a really good primer for covering metal. This is one of the metal models from the USMC starter box. So primed it gray, and then I primed it Army Painter green. Now something else you can do is just prime it gray and paint over with Army Painter's Army Green. You don't have to use Army Green. When you look at the USMC uniforms from the Pacific Theater in World War II, you'll notice a variety of shades of green there, and that's mainly because of the natural environment and the washing system they used for their uniforms really beat them up. So for my other USMC models, I've also used Elysian Green and Death World Forest. Use any type of green you want, because when we wash it, it'll change the tint on it. But to get started, I'm going to go to his helmet. And it's got the netting around it, so I'm going to use Luftwaffe Camo Green. It's a really dark green. Probably don't have to use this if you don't have a lot of varieties of green, you could probably just go with the Army Painter. When we wash it, it'll cover it up and change the tint some. But I noticed in some of the photos and artwork, the green on their helmets seemed a bit darker. I'm now going to paint his boots, and for that I'm going to use some Bugman's Glow. It's a brown with a bit of a reddish tint to it. I'm just going to use that on his boots. Don't worry about getting it on his pants. He'll probably get dirt on them later. I'm going to use some German Camo Beige World War II. And I'm going to use that to pick out some of the straps and belt and harness that he used for removing some of his gear. Now, what you notice about this model is that you can see a lot of straps on him for his Thompson, for some of his pouches, and you see they all crisscross along his back. So we're going to start to pick those out, and we're going to make them different colors in some cases. And we can see his little belt in there. Then we'll do the straps on his binoculars. He's got little cross straps here. At this point, we're going to use some Abaddon Black to pick out some of the black pieces on here, mostly equipment. So in this case, I'm going to do his binoculars. And then I'm going to throw some on Thompson. And we also do his pistol. To finish off the Thompson, I am going to take some Mornfang Brown and do the wood pieces on the Thompson. That's the forward grip. And the stocking grip in the back. I'm now going to use some German Camo Medium Brown to pick out his leather holster and some of these other pouches around him. Actually, probably just the leather holster and that one. I just need a little drop. I'm going to use some XV88 to paint in the rest of the leather pouches and some of the other leather straps running around him. So, big pouch back here. So I thought this little part of metal right here was part of his ammo case for the Thompson, but it's actually part of the strap. It goes around. Alright. The next step is we're going to treat the black on the weapon systems. And for that, I'm going to use some Runefang steel here. Now with this, I'm not going to put a thick layer of paint on. What I'm instead going to do is just brush a little bit of the silver, kind of like a highlight. That. Down the length of the barrel. And a little touch down his magazine. Alright, and the reason I'm doing that now is with the black as the base and the metal touched over it, I'm now going to wash the whole model. And for the weapon systems, it'll give it that look of the light catching the black of the weapon, and that silver will be the reflection. But it won't actually appear to be a bright silver because we're going to use some Nuln oil to dull it down. And we're also going to use that to dull down and tint all the browns of the leathers and straps. And that'll actually change the colors quite a bit depending on how much we put on. So when you do your Marine Force and you want them to be different colors because they're faded from being out in the jungle or on the beaches, you can use the same colors and just modify how much wash you put on. And I use a brush that I've messed up in the past for this guy. I'm going to lay it on mildly thick. Make sure to turn them upside down so you get the little recesses, because the Nuln oil will flow down, so it'll sometimes form these little air pockets under the model. And you can see right now from doing the weapon, it looks pretty dark right now and glistening in the reflection of the light for the camera. But when we show it after it's dried, it'll look more like a dull metal. Alright, so now I could use a hairdryer to dry this off and get it moving again. Instead, we're just going to let it air dry. Alright, we'll be back. So the Nuln oil has dried now, and if we look at the model, we can see how the Nuln oil has changed how the green looks. And so it's collected in the recesses, not so much on the surface, so it gives a more worn and faded look. We've also been able to get that metal, the silver, really toned down, so it actually just looks like the reflection off the black metal there. So now what I'm going to work with is his skin tone. And there's a variety of skin tones that you can use. For your Marines, you use standard Caucasian, 6, Navajo, variety of groups served with the Marine Corps at the time period. So what I'm going to go for is I'm going to make that, I'm going to take his skin right there, and I'm going to put a layer of Meneth White Base by P3. Sometimes I'll also use Iron Rack Skin, and the reason I want that is that'll make the flesh tone I'm going to use pop out a little bit more. So I want a tone to look like a little bit of sunburn damage has gone on there. But I don't want to just put it over the green. I don't like how it looks. It kind of muddies up the appearance of the skin. So we're going to pop the top off here, and we're just going to take our little brush. And now at this point, you have to be a little bit more careful with how you put the paint on. We don't want to cross into the green. So we're going to just do his exposed arms. We're going to get the helmet straps in there too. You see, he's also got a little watch, but we're going to take care of that later. So we'll finish up putting this on. Now that I have the exposed skin areas dried and painted, let me put them back on his block there. I'm going to take some of the Army Painter tanned flesh. And I'm just going to put one smooth coat on. I've already have it on my palette. I didn't thin it down, but I'm only going to use one coat. It's going to glide over. I'm going to put it on his face, but I'm going to avoid putting it on the helmet straps that you see at the side there. The next step will be to wash the exposed areas of skin that I just painted and the little straps of his helmet. And for that, since I normally like to vary the skin color and tone amongst World War II Marines, I normally either thin down some contrast paint. I'm not going to do that in this one. I rarely use this just straight up. I normally thin it down and use it as a thicker wash. But in this case, I'm going to use some Agrax Earthshade, because like I said, I want to make it look like he's got a little bit more sunburn damage on his skin. So I'm just going to take one of my messed up brushes and just lightly put this on. And if you overstep, don't worry. This will go onto all the crevices so I can get his fingers to pop a little bit more. And one light touch with this stuff should be able to do it. Just push the liquid around until I've got it in the areas I want. This really helps the character of the model's face really pop out. So you actually have a little bit of time to decide how much you want on there. There. Alright, so we gotta let this dry for a while, and then we'll be back. Now that the wash has dried, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some more tanned flesh, and I'm just going to do some thin highlights on the upper parts of the arms and along the fingers and the knuckles. So we'll do like the cheekbones, bridge of the nose, just all the raised surfaces. We'll just draw those out by putting little touches of the tanned flesh. I'm not going to do the underside of the arms, that way it looks like light's coming down. Alright, now that I have the skin done, what I'm going to do is finally get to that watch band on his left arm. So I'm going to go back to my Abaddon Black. I'm just going to need a little bit of it. So with a little bit. So what happens is I beat the heck out of my brushes, and it gets that slight little bend in there, and that's normally considered bad. But what I do is I use that bend to get these little surfaces raised here. And even if you don't see it on the bottom, I like to know that the watch band's covered all the way around, which is hard to see on the camera. You can see this model and a lot of the Marine models, and they still do this today from my experience, where the watch face is on the inside of the hand. So it's on the inside of the left wrist, which I don't do that anymore because that's where I hold my coffee cup. And for the watch face, we are going to use some pallid witch flesh, although any type of white would do. And you don't have to pick out the watch face. No one's really going to ever notice, but I know it's there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my brush and just right in the center, just draw, get a big enough glob of paint, you can just set it right down in the middle, just try to make it look like a circle. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to take some moot green. Now this is a really bright green. It really doesn't seem to fit the theme of my island hopping marine here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little tool and scrape a little bit of green out. I got a little water pot off camera. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this green, mix it in my palette. So this is paint and water. What I'm going to do, grab the paint with this, and I'm going to move it up the side, and I'm going to see its viscosity as it runs down. Let me touch my water. What I'm looking for is to make sure that it's running really smooth, thicker than a wash. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of my old Citadel brushes, and I'm going to get loaded up with a bunch of paint. And so I'm going to pretend light is coming down and striking the model, and just on the top, push this moot green around. And if I feel like I put on too much, which I think I have, I can wipe it off. And see what this does. That was all off camera. Alright, so I'm going to load up my brush with some paint, and I'm going to push the moot green around. I'm going to pretend that the light's coming down, striking the top of the uniform, and say I put too much. I don't really want it going in the recesses too much and collecting there. That's more of a wash. What I'm looking for is a glaze. So I want to tint a lot of the model with this moot green. And so what this does, imagine I've taken Army Painter and I've darkened it up with the Nuln Oil, and with the thought that light is coming down, the green facing the sun should be brighter than the green in the shadow. And so by creating this type of thin down paint like a glaze and not like a wash, I can get that effect of just it's thick enough just to sit on top of the model. So it's kind of like a little color filter on there. If you're not comfortable doing this, don't. So just a little touch of color, just any place light would hit. Down the thighs. If you ever feel like you've put too much on, like I said, you can use the brush to get it off. Just take your finger and hit it, and it'll come off on your skin. See, that dampened it down some. And this is also a good way, depending on how many layers on there, if you want to have certain of the uniforms look more sun bleached than others. Yellow line collecting right there. Alright, so that brightened up a lot of the top there. So excellent, that's what I was going for. Alright, we're going to let that dry, and not, thankfully it's metal. We're going to let that dry, and we'll be back for the final step. For the final step here, actually, I mean more of a finishing step, not the final step. There's probably 2 more steps here to go. I'm going to take some dryad bark. So when I painted up my Marines, I wanted to get more of a volcanic look there. So I'm going to use the dryad bark just to paint over the base here. I use one of my messed up brushes to do that, since I'm just pushing color in here. Remember, if you hit part of the uniform with this basing color I'm using, then it could just be, you know, the local environment rubbing off on the uniform. It could be a happy accident. So now, put a lot on there, so we're going to have to let that dry. Now for the final step on our Marine here, what we're going to do is I'm going to dry brush the base to pick up the texture here, and then I'm going to dry brush up the figure to add a little bit of dustiness, weathering to them. So the best way I can show this, let's move the tray out of the way. I've got a piece of paper right here. I've got my Citadel small dry brush. I'm going to take just a little bit of paint on there, and for this I am using, once again, the German Camo Beige World War II, and I'm going to try to get most of the paint I just dipped off here, and I'm just going to rotate and brush this guy. I'm also going to do, notice he's got the helmet netting, and it's supposed to be green, but the netting's not green. So this is where I'm going to add that. Get a little bit more. So the place I want the most the beige to show up is on his helmet netting and on the texture of the base. And then I'll add some jungle foliage to it later. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do the whole figure like that. I'm going to put more beige at the bottom of the model than at the top to show, you know, more of the environment's rubbed off on them. It's also great to just add some pronouncement to the lines, pulls out the binoculars more, see? And it also can put it on his skin there, and that tones down, blends it pretty well for the skin tone, gives it a more even look. So you really want to get most of the paint off. You do this step, because just a little bit would do it. There is our World War II model for bolt action for the Pacific Theater. Alright, thank you for joining us at Miniature Wargaming Labs, and we'll see you next time.